body relax and doesn't fight no more. It only takes about 4 minutes, probably. Split her open. From her neck to her groin. From the knee to the hip. Took the skin off. Took the cords out. Took the fat off. And it was only about that big around anyway.
He stuffed her mouth with dirt and mud to keep her quiet. And
I don't know what's wrong with me.
It seems like some serial killers go unnoticed in the world with their stories, just sitting in prison, many of them long gone, but their terrible murders still happened. In particular, Arthur Shawcross, who has a broad valley of murdering people in a huge timeline. His individual murders may actually disturb you. Maybe Arthur's life is too well written as a serial killer. He has the childhood that you would think every serial killer should have. What makes them tick, having no empathy for life as they come into adulthood. Arthur's childhood, it has to make sense as the way he describes it. For everything to work the way it did with him, it has to be an indication of how killers are made. There's a story that Arthur tells of when he was in Vietnam as a soldier. He found 2 village girls. He tied up each of them to separate trees, one facing the other, so they could see each other, point blank. Arthur walks over to one of them, randomly picking her, and starts to tear her apart with a machete, limb by limb, while the other girl urinates and screams for her life. Arthur's stories of murder and his life are so disturbing that it's hard not to believe that he should always be talked about in the top food chain of serial killers. This is what a serial killer starts as, innocent to a vicious and ruthless walking nightmare. Arthur, in his later life, before he was known as the Genesee River killer that would capture the attention of the East Coast in the late 80s, no doubt has an addiction of assaulting women, mutilating them, and having a skewed understanding of what connection, love, empathy truly is. Arthur talks about his childhood to a great length, of how he was built into a monster. As you listen to Arthur describe his childhood, you find yourself in a place where you feel remorse from the sickness that Arthur would go through as a child. Arthur says that his own mother abused him in the worst ways possible as a child. She committed horrifying acts on Arthur when he turned age 7, also forcing Arthur to commit the acts on her. He says that his own aunt would do the same thing his mother did to him. He's one of 4 children in his family, but it seems, from what Arthur says, is that he was the only one to go through the hell he talks of growing up. Arthur might be one of the most interviewed serial killers when it comes to film and audio, and studied extensively. He's heavily documented while in prison. It seems that even Arthur, while in prison, is trying to understand his own upbringings, why he's done the things that he's done. He says some things he has remorse for, and some things he just doesn't. But what is remorse to Arthur? He says he's disgusted with what happened to him as a child, obviously directing him towards anger in his later years. The abuse went all the way into Arthur's teens, that as a child he suffered from night terrors, wetting the bed, and later on would start having relations with his own sister. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, the same woman that was highly embedded with Ted Bundy until the day he died, would go over his childhood the same way she would go over Arthur's childhood. She knows that Arthur had brain damage to where it made him act out these particular elements with and in his murders, but also disrupting his memory of what is fact and what is fiction. We know that Arthur, growing up, suffered 2 blows to the head as a child. Through all of Arthur's life, he would carry the scars from early into his childhood, the dents in the front of his head, and when x-rayed, it's seen that Arthur's frontal lobes are damaged. These dents have been there most of Arthur's life, even through every murder he committed. As he walks into high school, Arthur says that he becomes a bully, full of rage uncontrollable anger, and lack of patience. He picks on classmates. You might even say his first victims, learning how to take his own anger out before he physically lays hands on anybody. But soon Arthur will drop out with a low IQ. Arthur's family denies everything that he says, saying that he is lying, that none of this ever happened. They don't know why he would make up such atrocious lies. But Arthur says, what do you think they were going to say about such sick things they were doing to me? Arthur's life would continue to make bad turns. Barely in his 20s, would marry in 1964, but the marriage would only last a year. And in that 1 year, Arthur would help conceive a son, his first child, but not his last. Not much is known about Arthur in this moment. Arthur doesn't even seem to remember much. We do know that we are seeing traits of Arthur not liking to be alone, looking for constant physical contact from women. But before it seems that he starts to harm them, that Arthur was looking for a companion. And we see this in serial killers. It's not odd. Many of the people that have become serial killers, that are good at it, just make the leap one day before they start murdering victims. They very rarely ever hurt their spouse. It would break their cover. There's no real recorded violence of Arthur at this moment towards humans. That when he was a child into his teens, he did start harming animals and mutilating them. But it wouldn't take long before he took the leap into humans. Arthur is a petty criminal at this point. After his first child, he gets 6 months probation for burglary. In this, Arthur starts going through a slew of odd jobs around his town, just trying to make money to live off of, keep his head above water as he's wandering out in the world. Construction, a butcher, even a grave digger. His resume is full of odd jobs that lead him to more unknown jobs. Already in his early 20s, Arthur's showing an unstable personality, going from person to person, job to job, unfaithful to girlfriends, his wives. It's a common trait he'll keep his whole life. Maybe, perhaps showing that Arthur was telling the truth about his childhood, being taught wrong from right, and carrying a self-loathing hatred towards himself. But more than anything, women. His childhood has destroyed him. But with Arthur newly divorced, he would once again become newly married with his second wife. His first son he gives up all rights to, never seeing again. And he tries again to start a new life. With 1966 going into 1967, Arthur, on his second marriage, would have an interruption with how he was trying to live. He receives a letter saying that he's been drafted into the Vietnam War, and he's soon to report for basic training, which would ultimately lead to his next divorce. And Arthur's second wife, giving clues and insight to things she saw spiral and manifest out of Arthur in this moment. When we talk of the story of Arthur entering Vietnam, people that knew him at the time and his records of his time there from documentation are very misleading to what Arthur actually says happened to him. And the account of the story that Arthur brings back with him from Vietnam seems so unrealistic and repulsive. One can only hope that Arthur is lying. When he's asked what happened in Vietnam, he softly says, a lot of things happened in Vietnam. Arthur went to the war and country as a weapons specialist, so he says. He's there for 13 months, but when there, his story turns almost into a Rambo movie. He gives the stories of venturing off away from his platoon and base, on special missions, alone and doing recon. This is where Arthur gives his first account of a kill, but more of what sounds like a murder than war. He says that he comes across 2 women while out. The one with the weapon tries to pull it out, but Arthur says that he takes the machete from his backpack and swings it right into her neck, twice, removing her head. She falls to the ground, twitching, while the blood bleeds out of her neck. The other girl surrenders. Arthur says that he finds a way through C4 to make a small little fire to where he cooks pieces of the woman that he's already killed and starts to eat it right in front of the other girl that's tied up to the tree. As he bites into the small pieces of flesh he's cooked, he stands next to the girl that's alive, chewing on the flesh. His prisoner, she begins to defecate and urinate and screams, to where Arthur says that he starts asking her questions. She replies in broken English, giving him what he's looking for. Arthur returning to his base, explaining what he's done. He says that he's held in high regard and claims that when he left the country, he was leaving with 39 combat kills. Many believe that Arthur is making up the whole story in his mind, saying that he never even shot his weapon while in Vietnam. When Arthur's old leadership is contacted, asking questions about his time in Vietnam, they said that Arthur was nothing more than a supply clerk, and that's it, never seeing real combat. Arthur says this is a lie, but he is unable to give any names of who he was serving with in Vietnam. Arthur is released from the army and goes back home to go live in Clayton, New York. When he arrives back in town, he seems even more out of sorts than he was. Arthur says that the army teaches you how to kill, but not how to stop killing. He goes to visit his mother. When there, she'll ask him, "Have you seen your wife since you've been back in town?" Arthur says that he forgot he was even married. When Arthur truly starts to take lives, it's split up in 2 different decades. His first murders, back in his hometown of Watertown, New York, are oddly enough, most of the time not found on his resume with the list of victims, because the crimes are so disgraceful. Most people don't want to know about them. Arthur, now discharged from the army, finds himself back in the States, getting a divorce and committing small crimes, burglary and arson. When Arthur talks about his arsonary work, why he set a paper mill and a factory on fire in the factory where he happened to work, he said he couldn't go into it why he set them on fire. Arthur's last wife, before they divorced, says that when Arthur came back from war, he didn't seem right. She noticed habits that he had brought back. He was obsessed with fire, talking to himself, and even more than before, completely unpredictable. But Arthur is soon caught and sentenced to 5 years, but it would only last 22 months to bringing him freedom. Arthur would have involvement in protecting a guard during a prison riot that would soon have him transferred to another prison. But with this, it would give him an early release. More than likely, they saw that Arthur was a vet who had served and just made some bad decisions when returning home. There was no violence in Arthur's past up to this point. Arthur claims that while in prison, he was also assaulted by other inmates. This is another element many don't believe to be true from Arthur. With his release in 1971, late into that year, Arthur's back in Watertown, still a young man, and now trying to start another new life. Arthur finds the company of a young friend, a boy named Jack, 10 years old. Jack and Arthur, from what Arthur says, were fishing buddies, and they knew each other. Jack, being the young boy, probably admired Arthur, that he had been to war. He was an older man, but one day, it would end up becoming something else. In 1972, Jack would leave his home, just like any normal day, to see friends, from what his mother said. But Jack never returns home. His mother, at first, wasn't too worried about it getting dark outside. It was normal to stay out a little past the streetlights coming on. But soon, it becomes dark, much darker. With no signs of Jack, his mother, she starts calling other parents, asking, have they seen Jack? With no clues and no answers, she starts walking up and down the neighborhood. She's frantic. Her 10-year-old son, he hasn't come home. Days turn into months until Jack is found. But on that day, Jack did meet up with a friend, an older friend, Arthur. The details are not understood in full to this day, moment by moment, plea for plea of the excruciation of what Jack went through. But it's understood and known for a fact of what Arthur had done to him. On that day, Arthur says that Jack met up with him. Arthur told Jack to go home, leave him alone. Arthur said something changed in him, luring Jack into the woods and then grabbing him. He assaults Jack. We don't know how long. He beats him, he strips him, and eventually strangles him to death. When they find Jack months later, he's found with no clothes. He's been assaulted in a gruesome way. Even months later, they can tell. Arthur did unspeakable things to the boy that was his friend, and that he knew. It was the first murder to lead to many more. Now that Arthur has taken his first life that can be proven by evidence, oddly enough, his first victim being a 10-year-old boy, but never revisiting this type of victim, he would shift directions to a different side of victims. From the murder of Jack in May of 1972, going all the way to September of that same year, Arthur would find his next victim just by chance, sadly. In this time, Arthur was questioned by authorities about Jack. They knew that Arthur and the boy had spent much time together. Jack's mother was also concerned, and it said that she believed that Arthur did something to her son. But Arthur would only confess to Jack for his next murder. On September 2nd, an 8-year-old girl named Karen Hill would disappear. This particular murder is said to have made the grown men, the detectives working the case, seek counseling and even consider retiring early. Arthur never publicly talked about the kidnapping and murder of what he did to Karen in detail, as part of his plea deal that he would soon take. But what we know to be true is that on that day, a bridge that is now famous in murder history, Arthur was sitting on a bench right near the bridge, eating ice cream. Arthur finds himself with Karen. He starts talking to her, but he tricked her at some point to walk away with him. Arthur never talks about the murder openly when he's asked about Karen, about taking her underneath the bridge and assaulting her, packing her mouth and nostrils with wet mud and grass and rocks so she couldn't be heard. There's really no words for the cruelty that can be said for what happened to Karen. Its unfairness of how she had to leave this world. Arthur takes her body, placing big rocks on top of it. Karen's mother can't find her. She panics. She calls the police. Within days, they find Karen. She's underneath the bridge. Her feet are sticking out of the rock pile that Arthur put on top of her. As they remove the rocks, they find her and see what's been done to her. When the detectives walk up from the embankment, some of them don't want to talk about what they've just seen, and most of them will never speak a word of it. They see what's been done to Karen, the detail that happened. Arthur is soon picked up by the police from a canine unit, from a scent that was picked up from Karen that led all the way to the front door of Arthur's home, and also witnesses that saw Arthur and Karen talking to one another on the bridge. Arthur is now linked to 2 young children in their disappearance, months apart from each other. Arthur pleads his innocence for 2 weeks, but the constant questioning day in and day out and being watched by authorities, he finally starts to give little hints that maybe he was responsible. But he makes a deal, taking a lesser sentence if he admits to taking Karen and telling them where Jack is. Arthur, 27, married to his 3rd wife, is now about to go to prison. But even decades later, towards the end of Arthur's life, he still says he doesn't want to talk about what happened in Watertown. Arthur is sent to prison for less than 15 years of a 15-year sentence that he won't even serve. The community and families are shocked and hurt. Arthur took 2 young lives, but still will have a second life to live. As Arthur serves his sentence for more than a decade, he's released in 1987, and Arthur does what he always does. He starts a life from scratch. He moves around New York for some time, having trouble staying in one place, people hearing of the name Shawcross, knowing the terrible past attached to the name. He finds himself married again, a new wife, a new life, living in Rochester, New York. He's living the life of a boring, middle-aged man who works in a cheese factory, paying his bills, and fishing on the weekends, but fishing in the Genesee River, the river that he'll be linked to forever, soon enough. But like Arthur's old ways of wanting more and having a desire for violence, or maybe just an impulse, Arthur finds himself in old habits that are wanting to come out. He starts with simple elements of his normal life, splitting it in half, having a wife, a job, but then on the side, finding a girlfriend. But soon enough, that's still not enough. He starts to have one-night stands from women around town, but it's still not fulfilling him. He starts seeing women of the night. They eventually know Arthur. He's a regular. It's an impulse that turns into an addiction. But once again, it takes a turn into what Arthur really wants. He hasn't taken a life in 2 decades, but soon enough, he's about to start the next chapter of his life. On March 15th, 1988, Arthur would take the life of Dorothy Blackburn. It's a bit of an odd situation for Arthur, because he says more or less he wasn't even trying to hurt Dorothy. Just another night for Arthur visiting the strip of women giving quick pleasure for a small amount of money. Dorothy was a known prostitute who was known not to go all the way with any of her Johns because she was scared of AIDS. Arthur knew Dorothy. He had seen her. She was out that night to make what she could to feed her and her newborn baby of 6 months. Arthur finds Dorothy, picks her up in his car. They arrange money for Arthur to get Dorothy services. But while giving Arthur her attention, she accidentally bites him. Arthur pulls her up, yelling and snarling, smacks her, and then bites her. Dorothy screams. The bite is hard, leaving a mark that will later be found. Dorothy screams, fights. Arthur is furious. He grabs her by the throat and strangles her to death. Now Arthur has a young 27-year-old woman in his car that he's just strangled. Making a fast decision, he throws the body in a nearby creek right next to a bridge where she'll later be found. Arthur says that when he walks into his house that night, his wife doesn't recognize him. He looks off, not like himself, and Arthur says for even the next few days, he wasn't sure what happened, if it really happened, that he had actually took a life that night. Dorothy never shows up that night to pick up her baby. She's reported missing, and police start to look and ask around for her. In the coming week, they find her underneath the bridge, frozen, right where Arthur threw her out. Police are now on high alert. Arthur goes back to his life. He says when he did something wrong, he just put it on a shelf and shut the door. It's almost as if Arthur was testing the waters once again with his next murder. Just a few months later, he would meet Anna. She was a 27-year-old woman in a bad season in her life, hooked on drugs and having to work the streets to pay for her addiction. Once a young, beautiful woman, loved and looked over by her loved ones, now living in the hell of working the streets to survive. On July 9th, 1988, she finds herself alone in the woods with Arthur. Arthur gives the story that he was walking down a street, minding his own business, saying that Anna walks up to him, made an offer. Arthur agreed. The two of them walk into a nearby wooded area, close, very close, to the Genesee River. Arthur says that Anna starts to take off her clothes, and when she does that, he lunges after her, strangling her. He doesn't give much detail that if he did mess with her body. Arthur's thrill was simply to take life and feel it leaving someone's body, but cared nothing for the actual cold body itself. Unlike most serial killers, Anna is found much later, and when she's found, it's her skeleton. Nothing more, no real clues. Arthur says that once again he just goes back to his life with his wife, fishing, working, saying that he just forgot about murdering. It wasn't an addiction at that point. He just knew it was there when he wanted it, and he knew he could easily get away with it now. But as Arthur finds himself in 1989, he's not just an unfaithful husband at this point. He's an active killer, once again, to murder women. Dorothy, a homeless woman, in July of that year of 1989, would start a chain reaction of more murders for Arthur. Something set him off with this particular one. Dorothy Keller was taken in by Arthur into his home as a maid, paying her $4 an hour to clean his home. that he lived in with his new wife. Dorothy lived in the Shawcross home for some time, getting to know the both of them and getting to know Arthur very well. Arthur starts to have an affair with Dorothy. The last day she's seen, though, was on July 29th of '89. Arthur would take Dorothy fishing. The two would go down to the Genesee River. They spent the day together, and Arthur says, even getting romantic on the bankside. He says it started to rain, so they took shelter, but Arthur says the mood would soon change. He thought it was a good time to bring up pointing out something bad about the other person. He says that he confronted Dorothy about her stealing from him and his wife. Dorothy denies it. She starts yelling at Arthur and then threatening to tell Arthur's wife about what him and Dorothy had been up to. Arthur says he loses his patience, picks up a log, and swings it into the back of Dorothy's head more than once till it was mush. This was a person that Arthur knew and was very risky. A few months later, some of her remains were found. Her skull, or what was left of it, still has never turned up. After the murder of Dorothy, that August, Arthur, who was known to his friends as Art, becomes a married man. Arthur marries Rose finally, who he already called his wife, of 2 years of living with each other. They tie the knot. It's a huge party from what is said. Arthur cooks much of the food himself, invites friends and family. It's quite the celebration from what ongoers have said. People were happy for Arthur and Rose. But as soon as Arthur picks up his secret life again, despite the bliss of marriage, the next murder wasn't long after Dorothy. And with this murder, it will start a task force from the state going all the way to the FBI. Patricia Ives, she's picked up in the same area as the other women that disappeared. Patricia, 25, a young woman that works the streets at night. She's just a young girl. She's picked up one night by Arthur on September 29th. Her death is extremely violent. When the two find one another, they agree to spend time together for $25. The both of them end up in Arthur's car, arriving at a location. They start the process of spending time together. Arthur once again accuses the victim of pulling the first act. He says that Patricia, while he was on top of her, reached into the back of Arthur's pockets, trying to steal money from him. Arthur says he pushes her to the ground violently, then punched her while on the ground hard. He says Patricia starts to cry loudly. Arthur then assaults her while she's still alive, but soon puts his hands around her throat and squeezes until she goes limp. They find her body on October 27th behind the YMCA, and police know that they have a serial killer in their town. Her body is found close to the last two victims. It's obvious at this point that it's the same person killing these women. Arthur is still doing his day-to-day life, going to work, seeing his wife, spending time with her, but when he has downtime or makes an excuse up, he's still picking up random women at night, prostitutes. He doesn't kill everyone he meets, but in October, a month later, as the last victim was being found, still intact, Arthur picks up June. She's 30 and a mentally disabled slow person. Her death is known to be Arthur's most gruesome act from what he does to her. It would be a big turning point of madness for Arthur. On October 23rd, June would spend the day with Arthur. They had already known each other, Arthur asking June to go out with him, go for a walk. But what would happen that day? Arthur would once again blame his victim. He says that he spent the day with June at the local park. They walked around holding hands, feeding ducks, and kissing. Arthur paints the day with the image of himself looking like Prince Charming. It's hard to say of what was really going on that day with June and Arthur. What is truth when Arthur is giving the last count of her life? He says that they were kissing, but soon June would get up, mad, screaming, starting to freak out on Arthur, saying that she was going to call the cops. In a fit of rage, Arthur breaks her neck. He sits with her body for the rest of the day. Later that night, he drags her into tall grass. He then takes a knife and cuts her in one slice from her jaw to her groin. He then turns her on her stomach and leaves. June was found 3 weeks later from the smell of her body. Days later, Arthur picks up 22-year-old Frances Brown. Again, Arthur pulls the same routine, pulls to a dark private location. They agree on a price. Frances begins her services on Arthur. Arthur would choke her to death right in the car. He gives the account to the police that he chokes Frances to death, pushing her head down onto his phallus till she chokes to death. There's not much to go off of. Arthur really doesn't give much more detail. He finds a location, throws her out of the car, and drives off. On November 5th, 21-year-old Marie Welch is standing on the street looking for a John when Arthur pulls up on her. They make small talk. She hops in the car. Arthur takes her close to where the other victims are. Even while they're being found, it's becoming a game at this point to Arthur, knowing he's poking at authorities. More than not, Arthur knew what he was going to do to the young girl. It was motive for taking her life. Arthur says as they begin to have relations, he gives the excuse once again that Marie wants more money, asking him for more, and then trying to take it. Arthur says he becomes angry, and once again chokes the young girl to death. Although Arthur would change his story later on, saying that the young girl was having her time of month, making Arthur furious, and that's what really led to her death. Arthur's next murder is so unknown with information, it makes it even more of a sad situation for the victim. What is known about this is that Elizabeth Gibson hopped into Arthur's car on November 26. They agreed to exchange money for services. Arthur just gives the old excuse that she tries to steal from him, like the other women, but he does give the detail is that when he went to go choke her to death, that she fought so hard that she broke the gear shift in his car. But Arthur was able to hold her down, wrapping his hands around her neck long enough to stop her breathing. He drives off down rural roads, dumping her body out of the car where it's found the next day. It's December now. Arthur and his lovely new bride are getting ready for the holidays, but Arthur is addicted to his nighttime life now of picking up women. Arthur would give insight into this moment in his life, saying at this point he truly enjoyed taking life. He loved to squeeze his hands around a person's neck, squeezing hard, watching the life fade from the eyes of women. He enjoyed it, he casually says in an interview. It had turned into a drug in his life and had completely taken over. But even with the busy holidays coming up, Arthur still has a habit to fulfill. He picks up a woman named Darlene in the first week of December. Arthur gives a little more detail to this murder than one might think he would willingly admit to. He says that when he finds a place with Darlene in a dark road close to a park, Darlene starts her act on Arthur, but he is unable to become aroused. Darlene makes the mistake of making fun of Arthur, to where they both become irritated with one another. But as Darlene keeps making comments to Arthur, he snaps. He grabs Darlene and chokes her to death. He then drives down his usual roads. When no one's around, he kicks her body out of the car. December 18th, days before Christmas, June Cicero will die to the hands of Arthur Shawcross. This would be a graphic story that would unfold of what Arthur does to her. Arthur picks up Cicero, 34. They ride to a dark place at night, but in the middle of their time together, Arthur simply decides to choke her to death. When June stops breathing, Arthur drives off a little ways, eventually throwing her body not far into the woods. Remembering where it is, he keeps the thought of Cicero in his mind. Something about her stayed deep in the dark waters of his thoughts. 2 days later, Arthur drives back to her body. She's solid due to the cold winter weather. Arthur knew what he was going to do. He brought a butcher knife with him. He cuts out her private parts, puts them in a bag, takes them home with him, where he eats them. Arthur really can't give an explanation on why he acted out this process, other than it seemed like a good idea to him at the time. This all happens the week of Christmas, 1989. Christmas Day comes and goes. Arthur has a lovely day with his wife and family, but the very next day, on the 26th, Arthur is out looking for an opportunity to fulfill his dark habit. He finds his last victim, a woman named Felicia. Sadly, there's not much known other than she was from South Carolina and in a bad season in her life. He says that he really doesn't remember his time with her. It's left his mind for some reason, although he did choke her to death, to where she would be found a few days later. As the last few victims have been found from Arthur, autopsies start revealing and showing elements that the bodies have been tampered with after death, indicating that the killer has come back. When June Cicero's body was found, they could see what Arthur had done to her and could tell that the cuts that he had made into her were after her death. With this, authorities now know that they have a good chance to catch the killer if they set up surveillance around the area where they know bodies have already been found. And that's what they do. They bet on Arthur coming back to the areas where he had put bodies. And it doesn't take long before they get a bite. On January 5th of 1990, days after June was found, Arthur had returned to the same location where he had dumped her body. He steps out of the vehicle and starts to urinate. He looks above him to what he can hear and see. A helicopter flies directly over him, but what police see is a man standing right next to a crime scene. But not only that, an area where multiple women have been dumped. Arthur says he's confused, but it doesn't take long for authorities to rush to him and arrest him on suspicion at that moment. As they've now arrested Arthur, they bring him into a room. They start questioning him. They see Arthur's background and are even more suspicious of him, pushing into him, question after question. And it doesn't take long before Arthur just simply gives up, with him simply saying he was just tired and didn't care anymore. He admits to everything and enjoys talking about it. As Arthur is admitting to the murders, families of the victims are burying their daughters and mothers at that very moment. A year later, Arthur has his time in court where he's given multiple life sentences. Victims' families come together to see the man that took their loved ones. Even the mother of 8-year-old Karen Hill, a mother from almost 2 decades ago from the loss of her child from Arthur, showed her hand in support for the new victims' families. Even though many of Arthur's victims were not held to the most highest of society's standards, they were still people that were just in a rough time in their life that someone took advantage of. Arthur's whole life of killing spans over 30 years and seems more like a lack of bad police work, where pieces of the puzzle and clues out in the open weren't looked into, where the courts had previously failed and Arthur took advantage of it. His time in jail is simply a whole nother story, where one really gets to know Arthur. He still has women that flaunt to him, even remarrying again while in prison, and a daughter that will find him and make a relationship with him who she calls her father. In a sick and twisted way, there's much to learn from Arthur in the textbook of serial killers. He's unique, and that's what draws the element of attraction from so many people that want to know of why a person can act out vile attacks on people. But where Arthur's story ends with murdering people, a new one will begin.